like to welcome you to the kickoff of the CIMOPV workshop. It's Complex Interactions actually what is the title here? Mechanisms in Organic Photovoltaics. So it took us a while to get that acronym. If you can come up with a better one, please let us know. So the idea over the next couple of days is to really bring two communities together, which is the organic photovoltaic research community that has been active for 10 or 15 years, working on a very specialized topic. And then the community of complex and adaptive materials, which has been taking a little different perspective on novel mechanisms and correlations and some of the more deeper physics issues in materials. So the idea is we want to bring these two communities together over the next couple of days and see what kind of new ideas come out. Can we help answer some questions that are critical for organic semiconductors, for organic solar cells, and maybe feedback some newer problems and newer ideas for the adaptive materials people to look at. So we have 3 days of talks and workshops. We have a computational chemistry workshop for you. But the highlight in the beginning this morning is this panel discussion. And this is an international webcast and Telebridge on renewable and sustainable energy. We have a very prestigious panel to discuss with us. Let me first begin. I want to introduce the local host, Professor Paul Byrne, who will say a little bit about COPE and what's going on here.
Okay, thanks very much. I just like to formally welcome you on behalf of the University of Queensland. I know there's a whole bunch of people here who work here, so I won't welcome you. But for our sort of guests from overseas, it's great to have you with us. The area of organic optoelectronics, of which organic solar cells is one of them, is a major theme here at the University of Queensland, and we have the Centre for Organic Photonics and Electronics, which I believe all of you will have an opportunity to come and see later on today. There's a great bunch of people here from the centre, so if you want to talk to them about the work they're doing, they'll be willing to have a chat with you about that and tell you about some of the concepts and ideas that we're exploring, well, those things that we're about to talk about at any rate. As you've probably guessed, solar cells and solar energy in Queensland is great. If you just look outside, you'll see that we have no sun today. Queensland is known as or used to be known as the Sunshine State, but it's now known as the Smart State until we have another election, and then we'll probably become, I don't know, the country bumpkin state. But nevertheless, the remit of Queensland used to be beautiful one day, perfect the next. I think it's going to be wet one day and damp the next, so just enjoy the cool weather, because we don't have it very often. Anyway, I formally welcome you on behalf of Paul Meredith and myself as the local committee members, and I think you'll have a really good time over the next few days. So, welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Now, just a few formalities before we get underway. I'm Paul Meredith. I'm his partner in crime and co-director of COPE, and I'll be moderating this, or trying to moderate this discussion. Sometimes these things get a bit animated, but I'll try and keep control. A few housekeeping notices for those of you who are new to the workshop and haven't been on iCamp. I've got to read this out. Fire alarms, in the event of a fire alarm being activated, please get out as quickly as possible and meet on the grassy area in front of the knoll. Toilets are just around the corner. Name badges, wear your name badges at all times, please, because we've got several things going on in this building at the same time, and we need to keep a tab on people. And after this, it's morning and afternoon teas are all served just in the tea room around the corner, and everybody's welcome to attend that. The format of this morning is I think, reasonably simple anyway. We're going to have a discussion now in this webcast for about an hour and a quarter, up to about 10:30, up to about tea time. Okay, this morning, and then for our guests that are not from the University of Queensland, we'll be running a set of lab tours. And if you could meet back in here, please, just after tea. What time are we going to do tea? Sean, have we got a programme? 10:30 will be tea time. So if you can meet back in here about 11 o'clock, and we have some of our guys lined up to take you around and show you our labs, which I hope you'll enjoy. And as Paul said, we would love for you to engage in discussion with our staff and students. And during the course of the next few days, you'll hear a few of them talk about their work. Okay, so let's kick off this panel discussion. When Ivan suggested we do this, I thought it was an excellent idea. I think that Many of us work in this field because we see it as the future for high technology. And many of us focus on this concept of next generation photovoltaics because we're passionate advocates of the fact that we believe that this is one big part of the solution to our energy problem, which all of you, especially your generation, will be grappling with for the next 5 decades more than likely. So we all got a lot of passion around this, and the people that we've got on this panel are all extremely passionate about this. We're going to focus the discussion as befitting on the workshop around solar energy and what solar energy can do to help us with this energy crisis. We've got some extremely notable and eminent people on this panel. We're very lucky to have them. So I'm not going to introduce them in great detail, but I'll go through them one by one. We've got Professor Gary Reynolds from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the USA. It is the premier laboratory in the United States, if not globally, in the integration of technology around renewable energy, all facets of it. We've got Professor Ove Goldberg, who is the UQ Global Change Institute Director, and he is an extremely eminent voice in climate adaptation and specifically how this affects biological systems and what's happening to our marine climates. And Ove has been campaigning now for the last couple of years very strongly around the traps to try and highlight the problems that we in Australia particularly are going to face. We've got Dr. Ian Ross from the Institute of Molecular Biosciences here at UQ, and his particular expertise is in microalgal biofuels, and he says that he believes that that is, in fact, the use of solar energy in a very direct way, and we'll hear about that in a few minutes. John Foster, Professor John Foster, who is an eminent economist in Australia, and is a speciality is energy economics, and he's going to tell us about the costs of implementing renewable energy and the costs of not implementing renewable energy. And finally, we've got Professor Dan Cox, who's then a member of ICAM from UC Davis, and you would have heard him speak a little bit earlier in the week about things solar. So that's the panel. There are people that are telecasting in from around the globe, we think, yes? And so I would invite all of our international colleagues to submit questions to the panel, which will be read out by our audiovisual people as and when they come in. So a hand will go up and a question will get posed. But the format of what we're going to do to start with, just so everyone's aware, we'll have a quick intro from the panel. Each one of them is going to give their perspective on this particular problem for 5 minutes or so. I'll open up then with a few very specific questions that have been submitted to us, and then I'll open it up to you guys. And by that time, I think the discussion should be kicking off quite nicely. Okay? So I think we'll maybe start with Ove, if we could. Because I'd like him to give his perspective on what happens if we don't do anything.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks for allowing me to address this audience and an unknown one worldwide. So my research interests have focused on how ecosystems have been responding to rising carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And those sort of interests have led to involvement with things like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where I've been a contributing author and currently am a coordinating lead author. And that, of course, is a highly credible assessment of the science behind climate change, all the way from the physics of the planet to the implications for economies and so on. I want to begin by just saying that there really isn't any serious or credible dissent now from the consensus that the Earth is undergoing very unusual changes, and that these are being driven by human activities that are changing gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And so as a result, as you probably know, we're now 0.8 degrees Celsius warmer in terms of average global temperature than we've been for a very long time over pre-industrial. And this is now driving major changes to weather patterns, rainfall, bushfires, you name it. Almost everything is now changing very rapidly. And this is affecting natural ecosystems, agricultural systems. So if you take Kakadu or the Great Barrier Reef and so on, you've got a whole series of serious threats. And to a large number of very credible scientists, we're now approaching thresholds where the previous linear behaviour of the planet may start to go through tipping points and non-linear things. So there's a growing risk that we're getting into a situation where we will essentially have conditions that will be unmanageable. So in Copenhagen last year, there was a science meeting in March where you had 1,600 of the most credible scientists involved with this issue producing a consensus, and this is on the web. And one of the most important parts of that consensus was that the identified limit, if you like, acceptable limit, if you want to have a safe and manageable planet, was identified. And this was 450 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, which is about a 2-degree rise above pre-industrial average global temperatures. That is really important because it's identified essentially a guardrail at which we need to work to keep the atmosphere and planetary temperatures under control. Now, if you then take that, it gives you essentially some measure of what you've got to do. And I should say that that guardrail is quite important because above that, you lose the Great Barrier Reef, you lose Kakadu, you start to have very serious shortages of water in many parts of the world, and most significantly, those are the temperatures, average temperatures globally, which would mean 3 or 4 degrees above Greenland and Antarctica, where you would have a complete breakdown of large amounts of ice that's currently above sea level. And that would mean something like an 8 to 12 metre sea level rise around the planet over the next 100 years. I don't have to tell you what that would mean to most cities in the world. So what do we have to do to deal with this? Well, if you take the modelling community that's looking at emissions and the consequences of those, they are saying that we've got about 700 gigatons of carbon left to emit into the atmosphere. Now, to give you an idea, we emit 30 gigatons of carbon each year. So that essentially means, if you do the sort of simple math, that we've got 23 years of current behaviour and then we've got to be completely zero. Or we've got 46 years at which we decrease at about 2% per annum in terms of global emissions. That, of course, and I'm sure my economist friends would say, that is a really tall order. It really involves switching strategy, and I think that is really what will be discussed today, is can we switch strategy rather dramatically to address this problem. So I'm going to then throw it over to my colleagues here, because that strategy about whether you can get to that target is a very important question. And I think we need to think of this a little like World War. The economies of world wars have been studied, and you don't win a world war by operating in the same space you did prior to the war breaking out. And so at the moment we're spending, if we spent less than 1% GDP growth over 50 years, we'd have a solution. And at the moment we're doing much less. During World War II, countries spent about 50% of their national incomes on fighting the war, and of course that was a very successful strategy in many cases. So I see this sort of on the scale of us having to adopt something like a Marshall Plan or a Manhattan Project, where we are stepping up to the challenge, changing what we're doing in a rather dramatic way. And of course I'll pass over to the technologists to say whether that's just a pipe dream.
Yes, I think that's a good intro to John, actually. I think it would be good to have your perspective on what this thing is going to cost. And then we're probably going to move into some technology with Ian and then our solar guys, okay?
Thank you. We've been, for the last couple of years, working on building models of basically the generation, transmission and distribution system of the NEM in Australia. The reason that we're doing this is that there's an enormous amount of uncertainty out there about what happens to our existing system when we start to crank up renewables. So we're actually building 2 different types of models to try and simulate what these effects are. And we've realised when we're doing that a lot of the inaction on climate change is because there's fear about the existing system collapsing as we introduce renewables on a large scale. So we've been spending a lot of time building these models. We're at the stage now where we are simulating saying, well, if we shock the existing system with significant different types of renewable energy, what are the effects? Some interesting results. are coming out. For example, a lot of people have felt that an intermediate solution as we're moving along the track is to switch to gas generation away from coal generation. And we found that in our simulations that although it looked like a good solution, turns out to be not such a good one, because we find in our models that gas prices go through the roof. The good news about gas prices going through the roof is that it makes other forms of alternative energy very viable. And we're gradually, as we've been doing our work, realizing that in fact the answer to a lot of these problems lies at the end of the spectrum that a lot of politicians take least seriously, and that's solar. The simulations we've been doing right now are showing that if we introduce solar thermal on a fairly massive scale, the costs per unit of power become quite competitive and quite attractive even from an economic, never mind an environmental perspective. We've also found that in our early simulations that commercial PV, which basically is putting PV on warehouses, supermarkets, everywhere you can with their big roofs, is also extremely useful because it makes an enormous impact on the peak power problem, which of course then relieves the whole system in terms of the need to expand it. We gradually, in our work, realised that in fact a solar strategy for countries like Australia, obviously it's not a strategy for some countries, but for countries like Australia and countries around the desert belts of the world, solar is a massive solution. But we find it's extremely hard to persuade a lot of politicians that in fact this is the case. The other thing, of course, about solar is it needs fairly massive regulatory change to enable the investments to be effective, because we have a regulatory structure that's attuned to entirely different forms of generation and distribution. And this is a huge issue that, in fact, we've only scratched the surface on. Most people in the solar industry will tell you that the biggest problem they face is a regulatory problem. So here again, there are all sorts of legal issues that we don't actually deal with, but it's very clear that if you're going to set up, if he's going to set up an effective incentive structure for people to invest on a massive scale in the private sector, very significant regulatory changes have to take place, and probably we have to have international agreements, which makes it even more complicated. I think a lot of the reticence that we see amongst politicians about enacting climate change is a fear of this whole host of transitional issues that in fact arise that make it incredibly difficult for them. But that's why we believe that if we build proper economic models of the power system and its interaction in the market system that are clear, that they can see what the effects of different things are, their confidence in terms of making ambitious decisions, the kind of large decisions that were discussed, will in fact come forward. One of the problems, I think, in the past, in large-scale discussions, for example, took place last year, was that nobody actually knew what the outcome of what they were talking about actually was, because the economic framework, generally speaking, isn't there. So there's an enormous task here to be done in the economic front, so that everybody understands pretty much what the implications of different strategies actually are, and that's where we're working right now.
Thanks, John. So I think we'll start with a little bit of technology discussion now. Maybe we'll go to Ian, and we've talked in John's case anyway about what one calls stationary energy, and that is to say the electrons that get squirted down the wire from a power station. But of course, we all know that we need to move around the planet, and that the case of non-stationary energy is one that is as important in many ways for keeping this globe running. And so that's, I guess, where Ian's going to.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Okay, so I'm from the Institute for Molecular Biosciences at the University of Queensland, and I also represent the Solar Biofuels Consortium there, which is an international research consortium trying to tackle various different aspects of liquid fuel systems, photosynthetic liquid fuel systems. So our focus is on ways to improve the efficiency and the cost efficiency and the scalability of these systems. And we very much consider microalgal biofuel systems to be a form of solar energy. And we sometimes joke that we have a low efficiency, self-assembling solar cell with onboard fuel storage. So, but we definitely take into account when we look at the efficiency of our systems, what's the light harvesting yield, what's the total energy conversion, what's the energy efficiency from beginning to end of the whole process, because it's important to us that we don't just have a recycling system here where we convert one thing into another, but we're actually harvesting solar energy efficiently. So microalgae are, of course, single-celled or simple multicellular organisms, which are the ancestral group from which our land plants evolved, although there's a few other catch-all groups in there, but essentially they're photosynthetic systems. So they have chloroplasts, they have a standard photosynthetic apparatus, and they capture solar energy and they fix carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they turn that into storage compounds, which can either be starch, which is similar to most of the land plants, or alternatively into fats and oils, typically in the form of triglycerides. And from those systems we can derive a variety of different fuels. So we can either extract lipid from them for conversion to biodiesel, which is probably the simplest approach. We can ferment the starch, if they're starch producers, to produce ethanol. We can take the whole biomass and put it through pyrolysis to produce liquid hydrocarbons in that way. We can ferment it to produce methane. And in some cases, and this is one of the systems that we're working on, we can actually coax these organisms to produce hydrogen as a direct product of solar energy conversion. And we see that as an important fuel source for the future, because from the point of view of carbon emissions, hydrogen is a very efficient way to convert sunlight into a usable fuel, a usable liquid fuel. But there's no doubt that at the moment the focus is on biodiesel and similar lipid-based liquid fuels, because they slot into the existing infrastructure that we've got. So one of the reasons that we see this as an important source of liquid fuels for the future is because when you look at the amount of arable land on the planet, there really are very few alternatives. There simply is not enough arable land to use conventional crop systems to make the quantities of biofuels that are necessary to make an impact on the energy mix. This doesn't mean that plant or crop-based biofuels can't be economically viable. They can. It doesn't mean that they're not workable. They are. It's ultimately, if we want to go to scale, they're not going to be sufficient. And microalgae, of course, which you can think of as a kind of hydroponic system, work. You can put them on non-arable land. You can grow them in salty water. You can use sewage as an input. So basically they're very amenable to scaling up, particularly in a country like Australia, which has large expanses of desert and doesn't require the use of that precious arable land which we need for growing food. So one of the things that we've been doing is to look at the commercial viability of these systems and the gross economic factors that regulate whether or not they're going to be workable systems. And the analyses that we've looked at have tried to identify out of the many, many different factors that you could optimise or that influence the system, what are the key ones that really make an impact on the overall viability of the system. And in a paper that we published last year in Nature Biotechnology, we identified 3 primary variables, one of which is the construction costs. And this is because this is an engineering problem, and it's essentially because you have to finance these systems. All the costs are up front. It's a bit opposite to nuclear energy, where the costs tend to be down the back. But you have to reduce those construction costs as much as possible. Secondly, the biomass yield is the most important biological parameter, not the oil content of the cell, not the ability to harvest efficiently, not the current oil price. And this is because your profit stream comes from various different aspects of the biomass, not just from the lipid content, because liquid biofuels, as we know, are essentially commodity products. And the third important variable is whether or not you're producing what we call high-value co-products. And this is a strategy that kind of splits the biofuels community, because some people think that if you're producing high value products, whether they be nutraceuticals or industrial enzymes, then you're not really a biofuels producer, you're really an enzyme producer. And the biofuels are just a kind of a sideline. But the reality is that, in fact, even though most of your profit stream might be coming from these high value products, in reality, most of the mass that you're producing is actually biofuel. And so we see that as a valid way to go, although we acknowledge that it may not be the only way to go. And as the technology improves, we hope that these systems will be more viable on their own merits, without the need to find high-value products to go along with them. But for the next decade or two, certainly, this is going to be a very important aspect. And because these high-value product markets are easily saturated, we need to find a plethora of different high-value products to work in these systems. And finally, I will put in a word for the importance of the regulatory framework, because at the stroke of a pen, a government can turn the economic viability of these systems from hopelessly non-viable into compelling. And so while we do focus on the economics and the technology, we do feel that's ultimately a very important aspect as well.
Thank you. And now we're going to take a kind of perspective from our friends across the pond in the US. I don't know whether Dan or Gary wants to go. Dan, so I'm standing next to you.
So I am not actively doing research in this area, but I'm helping to run ICAM, which has a potential to help in this area. And I'm passionate about the subject and been teaching a class on this to undergraduates at Davis and Ohio State for 14 years. And I really do believe just what Paul said, that those of us who have lived longer than you or lived before you have dumped a problem on your lap that's enormous, and you're going to be having to deal with the consequences. So if I can help in some way with ICAM, do something now, I really want to. So what I want to lay out there, I'll tell you more about the details of ICAM, but ICAM is essentially a scientific network that can move rapidly to convene research projects and workshops on interesting areas. And I guess I'm trying to filter through my mind as I'm listening to our distinguished panel. How can ICAM contribute here? We're primarily focused on fundamental research, or the center of gravity in physics and chemistry, I would say. On the other hand, we do have people in ICAM involved in economics issues. For example, the Santa Fe Institute, people at the University of Michigan, people at the University of Kyoto. And it occurs to me that one thing ICAM might be able to do is to have a joint workshop on economics of responding to global change and the fundamental or new technologies that might be helpful in that. Of course, part of the issue is that all the technologies aren't necessarily needed to be new, like solar thermal heating is not necessarily a breakthrough technology, but where we can help out, I think, is on convening people, for example, hopefully to initiate a study more globally than what you've done in Australia, to focus on the energies which are, the energy sources which are more suitable on each geography. In China, perhaps wind. In Europe, perhaps wind, for example. In the US, possibly some deep geothermal. So I think that's the message I want to leave, that ICAM is stepping up to want to help here. We want to nucleate collaborations, in particular in the fundamental science of these issues, but we wouldn't rule out some collaborations on economic and policy issues. And ICAM is here to try to help, as we are in funding this workshop.
And we'll hand over to Gary for the last kind of 5 minutes before we open the floor up to a few questions. And Gary, as I said, is from NREL, which is premier renewable energy laboratory in the world, let's say.
Thanks, Paul. So we're the premier laboratory. It's an interesting definition, because BP have just put $30 billion into a bucket to fund, that's the start, okay, 30 billion. And if you compare that to our laboratory's budget for the entire year, right, that's about 300 million. 300 million into the US's premier and only national laboratory dedicated to renewable energy. Okay? That's an awful perspective. And if we're going to throw in another statement about the Manhattan Project and scale those dollars up and talk about wars, there's something wrong. Quite clearly, we're playing, aren't we? We're just playing with the problem. So this meeting, I hope, is going to be helping some of you to think about the future, because you're a lot younger than us guys down front. Yeah, you are. Okay, you're a lot younger, and you're going to have to deal with the situation that we leave behind. So the problem's coming over to you. So if someone asks you how much do you need to run your Premier laboratory, say something like trillions, not billions, it may help you. So that's a perspective thing, and it's very easy to complain about funding, but we have to put it in perspective. 30 billion, Manhattan Project, 300 million, Premier Lab. They don't all fit in the same sentence, do they? So let me just tell you something about the laboratory. I think the people in it believe that they're working on a great mission. We're very, very proud of our mission. Renewable energy is the premier topic of science at the moment, and technology. It's been around for about 30 years. It started at the end of the 70s. Solar Energy Research Institute was what it was originally called, and over a drink I'll tell you who started it, and it's not who you imagine is going to start it. One of them was an actress, okay? was the founder of Sarah. But the lab, as I said, has been around for about 30 years. It houses, as part of its components, the three main entities are the National Centre for Photovoltaics, which I'll mention again in a moment, the National Wind Technology Centre, and the National Bioenergy Centre. And they are the three main hubs. There's a lot of other activity, but they're the three main hubs that I think we will recognise. And they are not the only places in the US where the research takes place, but they act as a focal point. The National Wind Technology Centre is probably the one that is closest to the market in terms of its deployment. There's lots of wind turbines. There's two enormous 2.5 megawatt turbines that have just been placed in my home in Boulder. And I'm one of those people who isn't an NIMBY. I don't mind them in my backyard. I think they look quite nice. But I think we all know that if you're going to try and use wind to solve the world's energy problems, that it's not going to cut it, because we don't live in windy places. We don't like living in windy places. So it doesn't work. And even if you add it all up, on land, there's not enough. And you have to go offshore. The moment you go offshore with wind, it becomes very expensive. And within that discussion, we have to talk about storage. Bioenergy is the transportation fuels. So we've had a brief moment discussing that with the algal approach. Our National Bioenergy Centre works on taking agricultural waste, corn stover, and wood pulp, etc., trying to turn that into liquid fuels. But the point is you have to be very, very careful, because there are some lobbies out there. And there are people who really, really want ethanol, but they want ethanol because they want to sell corn, not because they want to turn wood pulp into alcohol. So we have to be fairly careful. And then, of course, the last one is the National Centre for Photovoltaics, which I don't like to talk about budgets, but it has an in-house budget of $30 million. Okay? That's 6 orders of magnitude smaller than the budget that BP have put into their sorry pot, we'll call it. So it has a budget, and the National Centre for Photovoltaics, you will know it, I think, primarily not because of the devices that it makes, but because of its characterisation capabilities. It's one of these places that does characterisation of devices, and people who make solar cells like to take their devices to NREL to get a certification stamp, and it's meant to be a badge of honour that you have, and those people from England would call it a Blue Peter badge. It says that you've done something right. But the other thing that came out of the laboratory, which is very, very notable, is the multi-junction solar cell, the tandem solar cell, which most of you have seen. They're the ones on satellites and Mars rovers and anything where the weight is very, very important and the cost is not of direct relevance. But they are very, very efficient, and there are people trying to make them work on planet Earth, but of course we need large mirrors to cut down the area costs. It costs around $50,000 a square metre for those devices. This is a person who doesn't talk money, but I've said that about 16 times already, so I apologise. So it's a very, very expensive option. And then you can run down through all the other technologies: cadmium telluride, CIGS, CZTS, the new one on the block, silicon, of course, and then the last group is the exotonic solar cells, and I think that's what we're going to find is going to be discussed the most over the next 2 or 3 days. And I'm quite passionate about the organic approach, and the reason that I'm passionate about it is because of the involvement of chemistry. So is there a large number of chemists here? Please have some chemists. Okay. Is that it? Is it just one chemist? Okay. This is...
Chemists, come on, raise your hand.
There you go. Notice how they all sit on one side.
How many physicists? How many physicists?
Okay. Well, okay. I won't talk to the chemists, the physicists. Let me tell you something. Respect your chemist colleagues. They're the guys that are going to make your devices more effective, more efficient. They're the ones that are going to make it more stable. This is why I think the organic photovoltaic field is very, very exciting. It's because it's bringing in a new camp of scientists, people who can design things on a molecular level. So don't use the phrase ever in your life, all I need is a tame organic chemist, right? Because you'll never find one. Okay? But it's a very, very exciting time. Don't be put off with efficiencies. Don't be put off with the people who tell you it's going to be great. Keep fighting, because it is the way forward. It's a very, very viable option. So with that, I'll finish and hand back to Paul.
Thanks, Gary, for that passionate call to arms, which I'm sure other people find resonance on. Now we're going to start with a few pre-prime questions, which I'm going to kick off with, and I'm going to point at people to give their perspective, okay? I've been in and around this now for quite a number of years, and in and around the policy discussions as well, which are as important, if not more important at the moment, in the technology discussions, because I think a lot of us believe that the technology may not necessarily always find a way, but there are smart people around the globe who can make things work. And we have things on our portfolio right at the moment that can generate large amounts of baseload power in the stationary sense, and generate large amounts of combustible hydrocarbon fuels in the non-stationary sense. Okay? I don't think anybody's arguing with that around this table, although some naysayers would say that as scientists haven't done our job for the last 30 years in producing these things. They're wrong. They're absolutely wrong. So I'm going to start, and I'm probably going to give this one to Ove, what he sees right now, and not just an Australian perspective, but in a global perspective, as to what, the kind of major barriers that are really preventing us from taking all this technology that's on the shelf and dumping it into where it needs to be used. So the first discussion is around impediments. Feel free to wander into any subject which takes your fancy, including philosophy.
All right, well, to the question, and this is the perspective from a biologist who, and I guess I've been involved with this for about 20 years now, so I see an emergency. And what I don't quite understand is why the science isn't resonating through to put us onto an emergency footing. And if I'm to look at, what's standing in the way there, part of it is about how science communicates. We're not traditionally really great at communication, and we tend to talk in other languages at people. So I really see communication of science really important in this area right now. I also see the fact that this is such a core society issue, that the types of obstacles are not always on the surface. So you get scientists tripping over themselves when they go into public because they don't quite understand how all the machinations that go into this. So science will come out with a statement, and then it will be propagated around the traps and so on. So that's I think the second part of that problem. The third one is that we do have a special interest, in my opinion, that is perpetrating a misinformation campaign. And because this is a complex issue, I think the average citizen is finding it hard to pick their way through what is good science and what is simply ideological comment. And you see that in Australia, you see that in the United States, you see that almost everywhere you look. And so that's one of the barriers that we have to get beyond. We've got to work out how we do that. And that, of course, gets to the social sciences, which become really important in this. Biologists, physicists, chemists, and so on have a lot to contribute. We've really got to now look at why messages are not getting across and why then that's not empowering politicians. As you know, our opposition leader here in Australia said that climate change was crap. It was his contribution. That had a huge impact on the voting public. And so we've got to make sure that we can actually deal with those situations. We've got to communicate science better. We've got to understand what we're trying to achieve here. I think that's my contribution.
I just want to quickly say that that's where I think the World War II analogy doesn't quite work. Because in World War II, the Nazis invaded Germany. There was a very clear and present danger. The climate change danger is not as obvious because it's happening more slowly. And it's easy to rebut with one cold winter in Washington, D.C. Fox News, which I think an Australian started, was able to do an enormous amount of damage in the United States. And with a few leaked emails from East Anglia University, propaganda damage was enormous compared to the actual substance behind those emails. Was the propaganda damage that was done was enormous compared to the actual substance of those emails. So I guess it's an incredibly tricky communications problem. And also, as you say, what I point out to my students in my class, I pointed out here yesterday or the day before, is 85% of the economy is tied to fossil fuels. 85% of the energy is fossil fuels. That's really hard to change.
Yeah, I thought John might make a few comments about money, dollars a cent.
Just about money. Out there we have people who we call entrepreneurs who like to try and generate value in states of uncertainty. 70 or 80% will fail. But there's an enormous drive out there to do that. But when you look at entrepreneurship in a broader sense, what we're confronted here with is what I would call quite a complex system, where in fact, in order to enact quite a change on a large scale, there are basically 4 kinds of entrepreneurship that you need. The first one I would call social-cultural, which is basically people, Greenpeace for example, people who've got an enormous drive to change things, and they do it through the internet, and a lot of the climate change, the spread of concern about climate change has occurred because of what I would define as social-cultural entrepreneurship. People with a drive to try and, from their perspective, make a difference. But we've got other kinds of entrepreneurship. We've got political entrepreneurship, politicians who in fact see that they can advance their career by enacting a policy. We've got, of course, standard economic entrepreneurship, where people go out there and start a business, a solar business or whatever, and try and make some money, and maybe succeed or fail. We've also got technological entrepreneurship, which is, of course, closely tied to science. People look at basic science and try to develop technologies that, in fact, that are viable, and economic entrepreneurs will come along and pick those up. So what we've got here in this complex system are 4 distinct kinds of entrepreneurship that have to happen for great change to occur. The political entrepreneurship is not very helpful. It works best at the local level. It just does not work at the global level. I mean, politicians just can't work at the global level. So we've got to rely heavily on the social-cultural at the global scale. And so it's extremely important at that level. The economic entrepreneurship depends heavily on incentive structures and regulatory systems being favourable, so that those economic entrepreneurs can get on with the business of changing everything, investing in solar and other forms of technologies. The technological entrepreneurship, again, requires a significant investment by governments in engineering and all the activities related to bringing science forward. But as you can see, to have these 4 forms of entrepreneurship at different scales, some being relevant local, some global, some long-term, some short-term, it's an enormously complex problem. But ultimately, it's not so much governments that are fundamental here, but these social cultural movements that are going to make a difference, that will enact change, that will make people on the street be receptive, and ultimately will persuade the politicians to take local action. So I was just trying to give you a framework broader than economic to show that this notion of entrepreneurship isn't just narrowly defined. this action in uncertainty. And here we've got, in climate change, enormous uncertainty about what's going on. We've got enormous uncertainty, policy uncertainty. We just don't know what the policies are going to be in the future from an investment perspective. And so it's this sort of complex interaction that's making things so difficult. But I'm very optimistic because I think that there are plenty of examples in the past where, in fact, this complex system has actually resolved into very effective action.
I'd kind of like to refocus the discussion a little bit now and go back to the technology aspect of things, which is, of course, where a lot of the people in this room are interested in. And maybe I often think about this problem in terms of a big pipeline, right? There are certain things that we can do right now, and I think solar thermal utility scale fits into that, and distributed generation with PV fits into that. Maybe geothermal is a little bit further down the line, etc., etc. So it's a big pipeline, opportunity now, opportunity in the future. And so I probably want to hand the discussion over. Maybe I'll ping Ian on this one, because I don't know a lot about non-stationary energy, it must be said, and I'd like to get a feeling for what that pipeline looks like for our non-stationary energy needs from a technology perspective.
Okay, so I guess with this area, often these competing technologies are put forward in the sense that it's a race and someone's going to be the winner. We don't see it like that at all. We see generational change within every technology, and we see each one contributing to the energy mix. And in the case of liquid fuels, there's no doubt that at the moment there's a gold rush on around the world to start businesses that use microalgal biofuels and produce liquid fuels in this way. And that's partly due to the fact that some of the shortcomings of what we call first generation biofuels have been recognised, and in particular the corn ethanol is seen as being very, very marginal, if at all positive, in terms of being a renewable energy. The outlook for these is much better, but there's no doubt their first systems are going to be using wild type strains, not genetically engineered strains. They're going to be open pond systems, which are effectively like big swimming pools, and they're going to involve relatively conventional technology that we already have in place. The difficulty is in actually making these things viable, and that depends on regulatory frameworks. And although there's been a lot of prospectus shuffling around the world, and a lot of funding has gone into these systems, at the moment I would say they're on the very edge of profitability, and that'll probably improve as the oil price rises and as our experience with these systems improves a bit. But NREL, for example, has a long history of exposure to these sorts of systems, and they're not that easy. I think hydroponics is probably the best analogy, because hydroponics, as we know, is a perfectly viable system for growing crops, but it's definitely not as cheap as spreading seed out in the field. Down the track, the situation changes, because some of the techniques that we're working on, in particular some of the GMO techniques, will lead to improvements in overall efficiency, which will take these systems beyond the marginal level and into sort of standalone systems. And the kind of things that we're working on are mutations to the photosynthetic apparatus, which means that the initial light absorption, paradoxically, is not so much light gets absorbed, and that actually means you get better light penetration into the culture. That means you can start to turn a two-dimensional system into a three-dimensional system and get better bulk yields out. The hydrogen system that I alluded to is also something that's going to take a fair bit of development, and we're looking at probably 10, 20 years down the track before we start to have anything like a viable hydrogen-based fuel system coming out of microalgae. So in terms of generational change, I see conventional systems first. We're working on bioreactors, and we're just setting up a pilot plant to look at what we call closed bioreactor systems, which are a little bit analogous to fermenter systems, which harvest light in a much more controlled environment with appropriate sensor technology, and that of course is more expensive, but we feel that's very viable, and that's probably in the next decade or so, and we see hydrogen coming further down the track, 20 to 30 years time. So there will be several generations of liquid fuels from algae. Does that cover what you were after?
I'd actually like now to ask Gary to kind of follow up on that discussion, but I mean, we're very focused on solar in this room, right? I've got my own views as to what I think the pipeline looks like, and maybe you can give us your views.
What's first, what's next? Oh, okay. The 50 years ago, when they made the first silicon cell at Bell Labs, over 50 years ago, this was the answer to all of our energy problems. One of the problems with the photovoltaic community is that we've been saying the same thing for 50 years, and that's doing us a lot of harm. And so we have this legacy as a community that we have to use the same argument that we were using 50 years ago, and we have not really, we have not been successful. And it's mostly economics. It costs too much, basically costs too much to make a solar panel these days, regardless of which technology you wish to use. One of the things, I'm going to kind of change the subject a little bit, because one of the things that I found is really quite empowering, because the comment that was made a moment ago was about scientists talking. Okay? We have a tendency to preach. The renewable energy community preaches more than any other. We have all of this wonderful information at our disposal, and we say bad things about coal, and we say bad things about oil, but how many here rode to this lecture theatre on a bicycle or walked? And you find the numbers quite low. How did I get to this country? I was on a flight for 14 hours. Like that was, so we're all slightly hypocritical in that we complain about our existing infrastructure, use it daily, and then to say how wonderful it would be if we changed it all. So we have to be fairly careful, and preaching is not the right way to go. Having facts at our disposal is incredibly useful, and one of the things that I like to do is pick up snippets of information so that when people who are non-believers, people like someone in your opposition who said, it's amazing, the opposition can say, oh, I don't believe in it, it's all a load of old rubbish, and everyone says, oh, that's okay then. It's totally acceptable, but on the other side, we can't say, no, you're wrong, because they say, well, why are we wrong? You stumble, you can't come up with the right reasons. So come up with some facts of your own, work it out, and put it into perspective. There's a couple I like, or dislike actually. So when I take my car, I rode the bus to the airport, just so you know. I left my car at home and used public transport to get to the airport. But as the bus enters the airport, which is a brand new airport in Colorado, there's an array, a humongous array of solar panels, silicon-based solar panels. There must be, I'm looking at Yao over there, must be, I'll use acres because I still can't think in hectares, but there must be at least 10 acres of scanning, single-axis scanning silicon solar panels. And you think that this thing's is going to power Colorado. But then when you get inside and you find the little sign that tells you what it does, it powers the train that runs people from the main terminal out to the other terminals for 6 months of the year. Right? So we need to double it to run that train for the whole year. Now, of course, the fact that's missing from this is we don't know what percentage of the energy consumption of the airport constitutes the train. Now, I wanted them to say what we really do is power all the lights in the airport for an entire year, and we have energy left over to run McDonald's. That would have been fantastic. But they didn't. They chose the train. So that's a useful snippet. Find out snippets so that you have these facts at your disposal. Go to your home, look at your electricity bill, and then say, okay, the peak usage of my house was 2.5 kilowatts at one stage. So I need a 2.5 kilowatt array on my roof. Oh, hang on a minute, the sun doesn't shine all the time, so if I want to make sure that I don't use anything from the grid, then I need 5 times that amount. So I have to have an installed capacity now of close to 15 kilowatt hours. So how efficient does the panel have to be on the roof of your house, pointing in the right direction, Okay? And how efficient does it have to be? That's a useful fact to have. And you need to know that. Another one is when you drive to work and you use a gallon of fuel, say, to drive to work out how many barrels of oil had to be dug up and how many seconds it took for that amount of oil to come out into the Gulf at the moment. Milliseconds, maybe. Okay. But these are all very, very useful facts so that when you're out there, you don't have to preach. You can use good, hardcore facts. When someone says to you, oh, we'll do it all with wind, you can say, well, actually, no, that's not quite right because, and then you come up with a useful fact. Because if we used all the world's wind capacity, it would probably give us about 1 terawatt per year. And that's an order of magnitude less than we actually need. Right? Good facts.
Okay, well, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to offer up, I'm sure there's some questions that will be bubbling around the back of your head. Ask about anything you want. Quiz people on peak oil. Ask John how much a unit of electricity is going to cost in a decade. Ask Ove what the roof's going to look like in 20 years, or whatever you want to do. So, have we got a question? What roof? That's right. So, I'm now opening up the floor, and if there are any questions that come in internationally as well, then we'll address those as well. We have. Okay, right, there we go. Kick off. Wouldn't be a bad idea just to mention your name as well, who you are, where you come from.
Hi, my name is Moritz Rieder. I'm from Germany, and I'm wondering what John is thinking about the feed-in tariff schemes to support the change in energy infrastructure, especially what the opinion in Australia is about that.
It's an excellent question, John.
Of course, the feed-in tariff is an excellent example of an incentive for people to invest in large scale. There's a remarkable political reluctance in Australia to have gross feed-in tariffs, which would make a huge difference to the investment profile. But again, when you consider the cost relative to the cost of other things, at least in the first stages, the gross feed-in tariff would not be a large budget item, simply because it's going to take a long time for large-scale investments to occur. Now, the German case, of course, is a good example of feed-in tariffs working very effectively. I can't tell you why, say, in Queensland, there's a reluctance for gross feed-in tariffs to be introduced, but it's a prime example of the difficulties in the incentive structure. But don't underestimate this, as Ian points out, this issue of regulation, which I think sometimes is even more important than incentive structures like, for example, feed-in tariffs. But I hope that within the next 5 years there will be gross feed-in tariffs available across the whole of the country, because I think it's absolutely essential to progress in renewable energy technologies.
I can maybe add a bit of perspective on that. We're having that discussion in state government at the moment, and I throw up facts. I agree with Gary completely. So the gross feed-in tariff in Germany over the last decade has resulted in about a 3% of the total electricity price rise. All the rest has been the standard stuff, inflation, building bigger networks, the Deutsche Mark fluctuating, whatever. So about 3%. I like to throw that one at the state government every time they come back with a no, we can't do it. And I'll tell you that the main reason that they hate it is because the people in Treasury say, well, you're imposing a false cost on energy. Right? I mean, how do you set the tariff level? Oh, you put your finger in the air. Well, no, Germans generally don't put fingers in the air. They think about things very deeply. Even when the tariff was costing too much. So you've seen the German tariff system being reduced. The other thing that's thrown at me quite a lot is, well, what about the Spaniards? Have we got any Spaniards here? No? No Spaniards? Anybody overseas? Sorry about this. The Spanish tariff system has been a disaster. Okay? An absolute disaster for this whole discussion. It's had to be won back completely. And if you listen to the Conservatives, they would say it's one of the things that's bankrupting Spain. There are many things that are bankrupting Spain, but it's one of them. It's a relatively small one. But they will put that up there and say it's an economic disaster, and they've had to wind it back. So there are good models, there are bad models, but I went to a CC meeting a couple of months ago, and 37 countries around the world have adopted a tariff system of some sort. In Australia, just for those that don't know, our states have net tariffs, most of them. New South Wales has a gross tariff, and a gross tariff is that every electron you produce from renewable energy that you squirt into the grid, you get paid for. New South Wales is 66 cents, is it, per kilowatt hour? In Queensland, it's 44 cents net per kilowatt hour, which is about 2.5 times what we're paying for black energy at the moment, which is 19.7, I think, cents per kilowatt hour. So there's a few perspectives on that. It's not an argument that is easy to win, but there's a lot of people trying to win it. Okay, anyone else got a perspective on the tariff system before we move on? Another question? There was another question just here.
I'm a professor of engineering from Colorado, and you left that category out when you're doing your polls. So I go to a lot of these talks, and I hear either materials issues or the social and political economic issues. I was wondering if the panel could address what they think are engineering issues in bringing something like organic photovoltaics into the market.
I'll take a stab at the engineering. So let's take one of the criticisms of organic photovoltaics. The first one that you'll hear is it's an inefficient technology. And the current record is just under 8% turning sunlight into energy. And that device is about 0.1 square centimetres inside, right? So, which is a long way short of what we actually need. But one of the difficulties is that if you made a solar panel and then did an assessment of how much it would cost to build the framework and the posts to nail it through your roof of your house, the balance of systems costs are huge. And then they dominate, actually. They totally dominate. So one of my colleagues who's just transitioned from being a postdoc in organic photovoltaics to being someone who works in analysis, which is a great position to be because he really appreciates both sides of the argument, gave me a number the other day and said something like 70% of the cost of installing just a traditional solar panel at the moment is the installation, the people installing it. And so if you have a complex engineering system that costs a lot of money to install, you start off really, really badly. And even if they said to you, I'm not going to put any active material on here, you will still spend a huge amount of money putting these panels on the roof of your home. So I think in terms of engineering, we need to get the cost, the balance of systems cost down. So that's the framework for the whole entity. In electrical engineering, it would be turning it from DC into AC. Better still, don't do that. You know, if you ever walked around your home and found how many of those little black transformers you had plugged into the wall, turning all of that AC into DC. And if you had a solar panel on the roof of your house, it could be turning the AC into your house so you can turn it back into DC to charge your iPhone. It's rather foolish. We have a bad system now. We need to. So that's not really an engineering issue, although you can obviously see how quickly engineering can contribute. So the simple answer is we need to make the balance of systems cost much, much smaller, and engineering, I think, is going to be the way that is done.
Okay, well, I think we might move to another question. It was on, young Ben.
Hi, I'm from the University of Queensland, as you may have guessed from Paul introducing me. I should probably preface this by saying I'm a chemist. It's primarily for Ian, but I guess other people might have a perspective. You've mentioned the other higher value products from the animal production. Do you think that we're going to start having to use things like biofuels as sources for petrochemicals? Because I think that's quite a large use for fossil fuels at the moment.
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, when we look at the possibilities for high-value products, we're exploring everything we can get our hands on. And the primary requirement is that the market is big enough to be worth mining, that the product is kind of doable in our system, and that the price of it is high enough. And so we've looked at bioplastics, we've looked at industrial precursors for chemical feedstocks, we've looked at enzymes and peptides, which we can use GMO for directly, and we've also looked at a variety of natural secondary metabolites such as unsaturated fatty acids and things like that, which the organisms make naturally or can be coaxed to make with very little change. But certainly we've got our eye on those sorts of feedstocks as one of the places where we can get value. And I know that there's fermentative systems to produce succinic acid, for example, which are now more cost effective than the petrochemical route of synthesis. Other examples are some of the unsaturated fatty acid production systems are now more effective using biotechnology than using chemical synthesis and the traditional approaches. So definitely there's a whole range there, and the bioplastics I'm actually personally quite interested in as well. But at the end of the day, it's about how valuable it is and how quickly the market will get saturated. Because one of the things you have to appreciate about biofuel systems is that to make an impact, they're going to have to be big. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of hectares, and they're going to be producing tons and tons and tons of material. And consequently, anything where the global market is 50 tonnes per year probably won't come into it.
I just wanted to ask you a question about the fertilisers you have to use to promote plant growth. And one of the problems with the traditional oil palm or other strategies is that the energy cost of producing the fertiliser often wipes out the savings in terms of having a biofuel. I'm just sort of interested in that from an algal point of view. For example, nitrogen fixation might be one way you go, but what are people thinking in this space?
Yeah, well, medium costs and fertiliser costs is something we considered when we looked at the economics of it. And it turns out that it's actually a very minor input. And one of the reasons for this is that what algae primarily need, apart from sunlight and CO2, is a nitrogen source and a phosphorus source. And there's a variety of trace elements and things like that. Nitrogen is actually not a big problem because there's so much nitrogen in the atmosphere, we can either fix it directly. The cost of fixing nitrogen energetically is actually not that bad. But more to the point, we actually have enormous amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus going to waste in our sewage systems. And so most of the microalgal biofuel systems that are being set up rely on some kind of crude nitrogen and phosphorus source coming from a nutrient outflow that's currently going to waste. And so a natural partner to these systems is sewage treatment plants and agricultural runoff and those sorts of sources. Yeah, that's right. Actually, phosphorus is the element that we're most concerned about because in the long term, there's a limited supply of phosphorus in the world, and 50 years down the track, we may find ourselves in trouble. Peak phosphorus, exactly.
Yeah, just have a quick question following up on that one. So if we really go to organic photovoltaics on a large scale, where do we get the input for the organic photovoltaics? Have people studied that? Would there be enough coming out of, I assume now they have to come from the oil industry, but is there enough that could come out of byproducts, for example, from the biofuels?
Okay, I'm going to preach. I think if you do, I'm going to look over at the guys over there because they can probably nod and shake in agreement with my numbers here, but if you actually did a calculation of producing, say, a terawatt and took a device that was, say, 15% efficient, and then worked out how much material, polymer material, you would actually need, it's actually too small for any major industry to want to get involved. That's the problem. You go back to the engineering thing, you probably need more aluminium to make the frames to hold it than you will the actual active material. But there is a follow-on from that. It's because, and this is a criticism I have of the silicon photovoltaic community, is that they always say that you have to have these to last for 25 years. Okay, and you should say, well, why? Why does it have to last for 25 years? And the reason it has to last for 25 years It's because of the amount of money you put into paying for it and the amount of energy that you put in at the front end in order to make it. It's a huge amount of energy. So, depending on who you ask, I use the pessimistic number, which is 7 years, and there are some people who use 4 years, but they're the number of years that this device has to be on the roof of your house or out in the field, working before you've recouped the energy that you put into making it in the first place. So there's a reason why 25 years is used, but the organic photovoltaic community doesn't need to do that. Because if the active material is relatively cheap, you can replace it on a more regular basis, providing you leave the installation infrastructure exactly the same. And in that way, you get over this problem. So that should encourage industry to start making more of this material. So then we get back to the original question, which is where do we get it from? And we just save a little bit of oil. So they're burning it.
Okay, we'll move the discussion. We've got a question at the back there. Okay, down the end.
I'm Ike Zella from Melbourne. My question is, currently the total global energy consumption is about, I think, 14 terawatt. And I would like to know, is there any calculations how much energy could be saved by using more efficient cars, better insulation housing, or more efficient appliances? Also, the second question is, in the European Union or other European countries, there are strict regulations on efficiency of appliances now and insulation of housing. And are these sorts of regulations, do you think they're going to be implemented in the US or the Australia in future soon?
Maybe John gets this one. Let's start with Henry.
It's pretty easy to reduce consumption by 10% just simply by insulation and designing buildings much better. In fact, 15% is not too difficult. It's entirely a regulatory matter, and I know in the United States, because the regulations are at the state and not federal level, it's a very big problem to actually enact regulations across the country that gives the scale which makes it worthwhile for the people who produce these systems to operate, to work. Even in the European Union, it's been quite a difficult matter to get regulations unified across the Union as opposed to different countries. This is a prime example of what we've been discussing, that it's a kind of elephant in the room, the legal and regulatory issues. Because as economists talk about, going down cost curves and reducing unit costs and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, it's the regular. It's also in the engineering context as well. I mean, in the engineering area, it's just riddled with regulatory constraints. Ask any electrical engineer, and they'll say that the biggest problem they have is this. There's a massive, extremely sensible regulations that relate to a previous era that have to be unwound, and there's not great certainty how to do it. But certainly the savings, and making more efficient use of energy is going to be a big part of the story of meeting climate change. Of course, the other problem is that it's easy to do in new buildings, but of course very costly to do in old buildings. But I think it goes back to what Ove was saying, that to really get all this going, you've got to have a kind of a Marshall Plan or some massive, war-footing kind of perspective to make it really happen.
Maybe I'll just make one brief comment on that. Yeah, there are multiple discussions going on at the moment with respect to, particularly air conditioners in Australia seem to be the thing that gets everyone a little bit hot under the collar, or the collar, the case may be. And we've realised that the last decade we've basically allowed what amounts to inefficient air conditioning systems to flood the Australian market, and it's causing our peak power demand to just go through the roof. A priori, we should have thought of that, shouldn't we? It's pretty obvious. And so all that legislation has been won back, and there's some very, very strong building standards codes coming in which won't allow you to do things like that. In Queensland we had a drought. Remember the drought? Very, very big drought. Wasn't it didn't rain for 10 years? It did. But our water down levels were down below 20% in some areas. And so we enacted what can only be described, and we'll pick up on this in a second, as a war footing with water. And Queensland was the star state in reducing its water consumption by something like 50% over a period of about 12 months. And that was complete community engagement. I got myself a 25 kilolitre water tank, for example. Okay, you can do it. And the discussion that's going on at the moment now is how do we make that happen for energy? And I agree with John, 10 to 15%, relatively easy cuts. That's changing light bulb stuff, all right? To get the really deep cuts, around about 30% that people think we can achieve and we should be able to achieve without much cost reduction. Again, that's probably doable, but the water example was that going from that 30 to 40% is the really hard yards, and that last 10%, which is nigh impossible, because we still have to produce energy, we still have to move around the globe. And there's a question at the front, I think, waiting patiently.
I'm Ruan Song from University of Northern Colorado. I have a question from a personal perspective or just the ordinary citizen in terms of implementing some of the renewable energy. My question is that whatever you want to implement, you always to change from one lifestyle to another. There are always some volunteers and people who are making conscious decision, wanting to be a leader in this area. However, if you have the money ready and you're trying to invest into renewable energy, but the options are very confusing, coming, as John mentioned, coming from all directions. Politicians and businessmen and scientists and other places. Giving an example that I have students who really want put the money ready and wanted to put into photovoltaic and change the rooftop. However, the advice he was receiving from all directions are especially for photovoltaic, because it's the ongoing research. So you always have a better technology improvement in this and in that. So the options are tremendous. And when you're trying to put this, and someone will tell you that, from a single array based, and then it's jump to the next one, which is thin film, and now organic and inorganic, and so on and so forth. So that's enough to confuse people. And what I would like to hear from the experts is that we heard the thin film at this moment is $1 per watt. So for the ordinary house, it's the 3 kilowatts, which is roughly $3,000. And counting, even your dog or something, it's not that bad to get the 3 kilowatts. However, if you really go to get the installation to actually put into action, the money goes up to 10 times as large. It's at $30,000. So, is this a technology problem, thin film, or is it a production problem, or is it business who are turning that into a very profitable business?
Yes. Who wants to take that one? Anybody want to take that one? Gary, you looking owner or something? Yes.
This is a great question, because it goes back to what I was saying about we've had 50 years of touting photovoltaics as the solution to the problem. We are still, as purchasers of these systems, in our early adopter phases. We're still early adopters after 50 years, which means that we're the people who... Actually, I think the solution is to put an Apple logo on it. Then we would, for some reason, and then tell people we're not going to sell it for 6 months, and then we'd all be queuing up outside the shop in 6 months. It is not an easy decision to make, and at the moment, and for the foreseeable future, you will be making that decision based on being an early adopter. Namely, I do it because I want to. It's not. You'll have to incur those costs. In the States, you're always trying to do it in the beginning of the financial year, because that's when all of the state budgets are higher and the federal budgets are higher, and they're going to give out incentives for you to do it, and then they all run out. So you're trying, and you don't want to do it at the end of the year because they're going to disappear. And it's very, very confusing because of this being still in the early adopter phase, and we had to get it out of that. Which technology? I'll tell you which technology I would put on the roof of my house, because I've already done it. It's solar thermal. So basically I heat the hot water of my house, and this goes back to my have the numbers at your disposal. I produce about 3 megawatts of hot water equivalents per year. It's about 3, and I live in Boulder, so which is a pretty good place to produce hot water. It's a great system, it's very efficient, and I have a storage system already built in, it's the water, so that works very, very well. And I want to buy a photovoltaic system. Now, if I were a patriotic American, then I would buy First Solar's cadmium telluride, not because it's the cost, but because it's actually the only American company in the top 10 manufacturers in the world. All the others come from either Japan or Germany or Spain or somewhere else, but it isn't from the US. So it comes down to what am I going to put on my roof? Do I have a big roof? If you have a very, very big roof or a huge, huge garden, then you might as well get something that's relatively speaking, inefficient, like a 12% device, because you're not worried about whether it takes up a large area, because you have a large area. But if you're in a small town and you have a very small footprint for your home, then you want an efficient one. So I get I think it's some powers, they're about 20% efficient. But these are all decisions that I can understand, very, very complicated. And if you went to an installation person, would they tell you these things? Cadmium telluride's okay, I'm not too worried about having it on the roof of my house, but you can see in some places that may not be such a good idea.
Let's go. We're going to take one more question and then we're going to summarise with a big question.
Go with your questions. Oh, any questions from abroad? I mean, I'm going to interrupt this question.
Are there any questions from abroad? No, we don't have any questions from abroad. Excellent.
Thank you, Paul. So hi, I'm Andy, another chemist from COPE here at UQ. And my question hails back to the socio-political aspects that everyone touched on slightly when they gave their initial address. And my question revolves around the fact that in the last couple of years, certainly in the more developed world and the nations that a lot of the speakers here have come from, there's been a great deal of political change. 18 months ago, the Bush administration came to its conclusion and the Obama administration took over in the States. Recently in the United Kingdom, we've had a general election and we now have a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government that have said they're going to club together for 5 years, but we'll have to see how that one goes. And in Australia, Tony Abbott was cited as having said earlier that climate change is a load of rubbish, but 12 months ago he wasn't even the opposition leader. Last week Australia hadn't had a woman Prime Minister this time, and now they do. Australia hasn't even had an election since 2007. So there's been a lot of political change going on, and it's been also said that at a stroke of a pen, politicians can change things. Now, how much of a hurdle is it to have this kind of political changeover this frequently? Every time you get a new bunch, a new administration, a new group of politicians in, you then have to win over all of those people again. Anyone that you had on side has been swept away. And is this something that we can address better in the future?
It's a really excellent question, and it comes down to the fact that this issue should not be subject to the ebb and flow of politics. And personally, I believe that we should be making these core parts of administration in countries. So you have the Independent Commission on Climate Change and Energy, or something like that, which doesn't have the ability, or isn't vulnerable, where a minister can come in and say, oh no, we've decided that climate change is not happening, and you disband all those clever policies. And I was talking to Paul just before this panel, about the vulnerability of really great steps forward that you're seeing in Queensland and how they may change if you get a different administration in. That country bumpkin one, who said that? I wasn't me. But I think this is what's happened, is that you've had this really important issue come through, and it's now time to mature it. So you don't have, for example, political spin on the ICAC, right, the Independent Commission on Corruption. You don't allow that to be bandied around and disbanded and so on. And the same thing with climate. We've got to put those things centrally. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's political science. That's an act of Parliament. But I think we need to go down that route because I think that we can't afford to have the buffeting around that we've been seeing recently. It's a really good question.
I want to speak a little bit from the perspective of the states. I can tell you, you can't do things with just the sign of a pen because every piece of the political machinery has to move together. And for Obama, Obama can do certain things with the sign of a pen. For example, he did make carbon dioxide a gas that was subject to oversight by the Environmental Protection Agency. He could do that, and that will force the Senate's hand on climate legislation. But to make large-scale change, he has to work with the Senate, and we have 40 senators at least in opposition, including some Senate conservative Democrats, who will try to make sure that that doesn't happen, and you need 60 votes to override the possible filibuster in the states. In California, one of the people running for governor has vowed to suspend the landmark climate legislation, which basically would kill it. The landmark climate legislation, which is one of the few things Schwarzenegger wants as part of his legacy. So why do I bring this up? Because it comes back to the socioeconomic entrepreneurship. If you want to make something happen in politics, you have to push. You have to push every single part of the system. There's one committee where a bill can die. The bill can die if the governor or president vetoes it, or prime minister, or however it works in the parliamentary system. I admit ignorance. You have to push every step of the way, and you have to keep pushing because the incentives on the political timescale are short-term generally, because they have to see how they get elected that next time in office. So every one of you who cares about this deeply has to push, and you have to push in concert, and that's where the social entrepreneurship that you talked about is incredibly important. And in my class, for example, the last 2 years, the students have had to go lobby Sacramento about, that's their project for the class, they've had to go lobby Sacramento about projects related to energy and climate, and then they get an idea of how difficult it can be. And so I think that's an important message. You have to push every time or nothing gets done.
Okay, that's actually a very nice segue into what I'm going to call the concluding part of this discussion now. It's going to be quite rapid because I want a cup of tea and a biscuit. So what we're hearing here is, I think, things that we all feel intuitively, and that is the technology we sort of have, but we need to create the socio-political framework in order to allow that to flow through to solve this problem. And again, back to the analogy of a war footing, in 1939 and 1940, the US set up the Manhattan Project, which was a very focused effort in developing and implementing one piece of technology, massively funded, highly successful, one would potentially argue. And so one question is asked to me quite a lot, and I'd like 1 minute from each one of our panel members on this, 1 minute only, if that, is what does the Climate Change Energy Manhattan Project look like? How would we implement it, and potentially on what timescales could we do that? Again, I'm going to start with Rolf, I think.
Well, not being an expert in the technology, I'll sidestep this and say that this could arise if we did have a really big impact, and I think that's a backdrop to then what this would look like. Let's imagine if, and this is not against Miami, but let's imagine that Miami got destroyed on a scale by megastorms. How would we now be viewing the question of whether we're stepping into a Manhattan or Marshall Plan style project? So with that,
What motivates dramatic change, I think, is visibility. I think back to the 1950s when London was enveloped in smog every winter and people were dying. It was very, very easy for governments to enact radical change at that time. In a very short period of time, the Clean Air Act and a whole sequence of other things get to a situation which was radically better. So, and the problem here in this context again is visibility. And you can see how the public responds to imagery. In the East Anglia case, the fact that maybe a glacier didn't seem to be melting, possibly melting as fast as somebody said. The image of a glacier melting is very important. The image of polar bears warming around, all this imagery is so important. But there's one thing a lot better than imagery, and that's a disaster, as we'll discuss. I honestly think that until we get some sort of disaster that possibly may not be 100% directly related to climate change, we won't get the kind of sort of congealment to motivate the kind of Manhattan Project kind of ideal. And I think we're all sitting waiting for something like that to happen, because I honestly don't believe. And again, if you take the Barrier Reef, that's a long, slow process. That's not going to do it. It's going to have to be something that's failed. And the public's waiting for that. When the public gets that, I think we'll see pretty significant things happen.
One of the another aspect of being a scientist in our preaching mode of renewable energy is our complaining mode about money. If you press a scientist buttons on his life as an academic, you'll get the money button pressed very, very easily. It's a big, large red one that sits about here. I work too hard and I can't do what I want to do because I don't have enough money. So the answer to the question of what does this new Manhattan Project for energy look like is actually money. And we have to pause for a moment, because that's not going to placate anyone, is it? So if I said I just need NREL's budget to go up by a factor of 10, that isn't. It's just so obvious. We need something a little bit better than that. We need to be able to work out what we're going to achieve, how we disperse that money throughout the world. Because one of the questions that I didn't answer was, I think it was your question, Ben, since you were introduced, is the energy that we're having, that we're using in America, in Europe, in Australia, is just a small part of the problem. Marty Hoffert did a calculation of the big problem, and it's population growth, and it's the bringing in online of countries that don't use as much energy as we currently use at the moment. So it's a huge, huge problem. And someone gave me a statistic the other day, which was rather a good one, that China has put in. Can you remember what the number was? It was something like China is going to invest $50 billion into renewable energy, and that is a huge, huge jump, because of course China is the one we're bringing on the new coal-fired power plants. Okay, so they're saying, well, we're bringing on the coal-fired power plants, but we're putting $50 billion into renewable energy. So maybe a good solution here would be to tie the investment into using fossil fuels. Actually producing CO2. So you have to put money into an investment pot for the future. But that investment pot needs to be very, very large. I wish I had the number. I do have the number somewhere of how much the Manhattan Project cost.
It was in 1986 dollars, it was just over 20 billion, so probably is about 30 billion. Okay.
Yeah, so we're and you know, BP. The poor guys are getting really hammered. Paul, should we say that? But 30 billion, they turned around 30 billion available over spent over the next 10 years, 5 years or something. Right, that's the number we need to. We don't need to give it all to Enron. That wouldn't work. In Australia, I suggest that every university has a department constructed so that the entire university can have interdisciplinary research where people could move from engineering, from chemistry and physics. A whole building, a whole department. And based on that department, you don't just have chemists and physicists, you have a degree in energy. Morph it, change it, don't keep on the existing boundary the same. And we need to do this throughout the whole world, not just in the United States, not in Europe, but in Africa. Do it in Africa as well. We're better than to do it in Africa. So they don't just say, well, the easiest thing to do is to dig up coal and burn it. So more 1 minute now. Sorry, Paul.
Okay, my 2 cents worth. I guess as a biologist, you naturally think in evolutionary terms, and I have great confidence that the swathe of technologies that are out there to help deal with this problem will fight with each other. Will evolve the appropriate technologies, and that's the job of scientists and engineers. And they can and will be implemented, and they won't be implemented necessarily efficiently. There will be blood, there'll be corruption, there'll be inefficient schemes, there'll be disasters and so on. But the primary motivation really is the perception of the public that gives permission for politicians to act. And I agree that disasters are a very effective method of polarising public opinion, and I think that the hurricane in the south of the USA in 2005 was an example which wasn't directly tied to climate change, but it certainly did create a swell of public perception. I think at the time of election of the current government, climate change was a much bigger issue than perhaps it is at the moment, following on from the global financial crisis. But at the same time, I don't think it's just a matter of the available technologies, and I don't think it's just a matter of the available funding. I think all of those things are driven by the ability of politicians to follow where public opinion leads, and that's at core an emotional issue. You won't convince the bulk of the public by closely reasoned logical arguments, although they have to be there, underpinning everything. But that imagery is really key to it. So that's my perspective.
So just a couple of quick things to try to pull this together from my perspective. Yeah, I was going to mention Katrina. Hurricane Katrina did impact people's thinking, and there is a fact behind that connected to climate change, which is that one aspect of climate change is to increase the frequency of large hurricanes and cyclones. So even if you can't directly attribute it, you can tie it back to a fact. And what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico close to New Orleans right now with the Deepwater Horizon disaster is another image that is actually apparently modifying public opinion in states right now. There seems to be a reduced demand of oil, and it's not because of the cost. Those images are having an effect, and there's a fact associated with that, which is that to get to the remaining fossil fuels, it's harder and harder, and we can point that out. So that even if we want to continue with fossil fuels, it's not going to be easier, and the costs are going to go up. A couple of other facts associated with this Manhattan Project issue. The photovoltaics, as you mentioned, were about 55 years ago at Bell Labs. The first working fuel cell was also about 55 years ago, and the first implementation of nuclear power was about 55 years ago for commercial purposes. But guess what got all the money in that aspect for energy research? So it's interesting to think about that, but those are some other facts. Oh gosh, I was on a roll there. Maybe I just need to give up the microphone. No, don't take it from me. But I guess I just wanted to emphasize that I agree that we need that level of spending, but unlike the Manhattan Project, it's not one product we're looking for. Every country and every region will have a heterogeneity of different energy sources that might be viable, and we should keep that in mind, but we need that kind of level of spending on a per capita basis if we spread that over the world. And I agree with you also that we need to look to a rethinking of the academy so that we don't stovepipe people in departments, because that's a huge barrier to actually making things happen. And there are little ways you can change that easily, and a change in the university on a large scale is almost as hard as getting legislation passed in Congress.
That's a great note to end on, the megalithic pace that the university change moves at. Okay, I'd like to personally thank all of the panel members for a fascinating discussion. I do a few questions in your time. Let's give them a clap. Okay, so just moving forward now into more mundane things. There's a cup of tea and a biscuit waiting. And if you want to be back in here in about 20 minutes, so about 10 past, we'll start some lab tours of COPE. The kind of formal program starts at 1 o'clock this afternoon.